welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. There's an important and ongoing discussion these days about who gets included in, or left out of, histories of performance and the theater. That also applies to the history of specific theatrical movements. It's a problem that our guest for today's episode has been grappling with in her work, which looks at the development of Nuyorican performance and hip-hop theater and explores how women have played a crucial but underappreciated role within those movements. Dr. Patricia Herrera is an associate professor of theater at the University of Richmond and the author of Nuyorican Feminist Performance, From the Café to Hip-Hop Theater. Dr. Herrera is also a playwright and was the co-founder of Ruby Theater Company, as well as the co-creator of public humanities projects, such as a digital archive documenting Virginia's civil rights history. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today. You know, the Theater History Podcast has been such a great resource for me and my students, so I'm very thankful to be here with you today.
Thank you. Let's maybe talk a little bit about terminology to start. You use the term Nuyorican in the title and throughout the book, but you start by highlighting how that can be a kind of complicated term. Could you maybe just explain that a little bit more to us?
Yeah, sure. I want to stress how the term itself is rich and it encompasses social, cultural, and historical and political workings, and that it may shift or evolve depending on time, place, or even individuals, right? So I want to kind of start with how the term in itself kind of exploded. The release of the anthology Nuyorican Poetry, an anthology of words and feelings, which was published in 1975 and co-edited by the Nuyorican Poets Café founders Miguel Algarín and Miguel Piñero. They were the first ones to kind of popularize the term Nuyorican. And so with this anthology, that the term and even the aesthetic began to develop and evolve. I think in the most simplest terms, the Nuyorican means someone who is culturally connected to Puerto Rico, but lives in New York. And it's the beauty of creating a new language, right? By fusing two words together, that actually is a model of what we see on the stage and in performance. It's also meant to really reflect the ways of speaking, of being, of feeling, of creating identity. And so it's much more than just being Puerto Rican, living in New York City. It's really a practice. It's a way of embodying culture, language, and spaces that you navigate and inhabit. But even before this term was popularized, I want to also kind of contextualize a little bit. There was another poet who also played with fusing languages, and he came up with the term Nuyorican. He has a well-known book of poetry called Jet Nuyoriqueño or Nuyorican Jetliner, which is also a collection of Spanish and English poems. And he coins the term Nuyorican there. And so it's very similar to Nuyorican in that it expresses the ways the colonial history between Puerto Rico and the United States have shaped the identity and experiences of many people and many Puerto Ricans. And so poets like Miguel Algarín and Miguel Piñero and Jaime Carrero, these who are included in the anthology, as well as other poets like Sandra Maria Esteves, Martita Morales, Luz Rodriguez, and Amina Muñoz, these poets are part of a generation that were born near the end of World War II and who were deeply impacted by Operation Bootstrap. Now, Operation Bootstrap was a stimulus program that really offered US companies tax incentives to develop manufacturing plants in the island, right? And this in turn meant that it transformed Puerto Rico's agricultural economy into an industrial one. And so while we see some jobs increasing in the industrial world, we also see a rapid decrease of increase of unemployment because of this shift, right? And so this really causes this mass emigration from Puerto Rico in the 1940s and 1950s, particularly in New York City. And so it's the children of these Puerto Ricans who immigrated that's that generation that comes of age in the 1960s who was shaped by this period of migration and industrialization, and that we see them distinctly position themselves as New York and Puerto Ricans, right? And they come to call themselves Nuyoricans. And so this gets us into thinking about the Nuyorican movements and the people, artists, educators, and intellectuals involved in this social revolution that's really linked in notions of anti-colonial movements and international liberation. But I think the term continues to be used today to affirm these cultural ties with Puerto Rico, as well as thinking about anti-colonialism. And it's an aesthetic, it's an affective sense rooted in notions of morality and in performance. So that's kind of where I place myself in conversation with when I explore these various poets and performers in the book.
Now, I know you're challenging some of the traditional histories of this movement, particularly the Nuyorican Poets Café. But could we start out with just a basic overview of the Café and its historical importance?
Yes. I mean, one thing to stress is that the Café is still open today, right? So in itself, that's big for a cultural artistic venue to have that quite a bit long-standing. Prior to it being the Nuyorican Poets Café, Miguel Algarin was leading a workshop that he called El Puerto Rican Playwrights Actors Workshop. And so interestingly, and this is where I think theater history becomes really interesting, this was a group that really was supported by Joseph Papp. And he provided a workspace for them in Astor Place. And like many of the experimental theaters in the 1960s, such as maybe the Living Theater, Open Theater, this Puerto Rican workshop, playwrights workshop, really also really thought about the collective. Really, how do you bring the collective into notions of performance and rejecting traditional theater practices that really focuses on plot, character, and this kind of hierarchy and directors. And so the group itself in its workshop format was thinking and talking already about how to use plays, how to use theater, how to use performance to push against and fight against social injustices. And so the members in the group were also personally invested in the livelihood of Nuyorican and the livelihoods of Latinos in general. So it was during this time that Joseph Papp was also negotiating with Miguel Piñero's play Short Eyes, which goes off to be on Broadway, and introduces Piñero to Algarin. And this introduction really incites their long-lasting relationship, and it launches what we know of today as the Nuyorican Poets Café. Due to budget cuts, the actual physical space that was donated by Papp was lost. And so the group kept meeting, and they inevitably met in Algarin's apartment all the time. He got a little fed up with all the busyness in his own apartment. And so he ended up renting a place in the Lower East Side that was called the Sunshine Tavern, which was actually an Irish bar that had gone out of business. And that was in 1975. And it was then that we see the Nuyorican Poets Café opened its doors. And since then, it's been in different locations. It then moved to another location in 1978. And then today, it still stands in the same place between Avenue A, B, and 3rd, between Avenue A and B and C, sorry. And so I point to the notion of renting this abandoned building as kind of a pivotal point, because the act of reclaiming these abandoned buildings at that specific time by this artistic collective was also about reversing the deterioration in the Lower East Side. So as you know, during that time, there was a series of buildings being abandoned due to just the economy. Landowners would just abandon the buildings, right? So they can get some kind of return. So it was some artists like Miguel Algarin who really thought this is a moment to reclaim the space. And how can we use the space and the hands-on labor of Nuyorican and other Latinos to bring visibility to the space, as well as also to bring in the visibility of the art form itself. And so what we have is a physical space that reverberates a visual and performance aesthetic that, for me, it's rooted in resilience, it's rooted in resistance, and it's rooted in affirmation. The birth of that physical space is for me both a political feat as well as an artistic feat, especially when the Lower East Side is such a contested space. La Mama also has a very similar history as well in that way. And so that space, once you have a formal space, that means you also begin to formalize, right, what a Nuyorican aesthetic means. And so this is the moment where Algarín begins to publish and try to theorize in some ways, what encompasses a Nuyorican aesthetic. And he brings into the picture notions of orality. And this becomes really vital as we think about the continuity between Nuyorican poetry, slam poetry, and hip hop theater. And then, of course, because we're thinking about Puerto Ricans living in New York, the notion of cultural navigation and cultural negotiation between what is New York and what is Puerto Rico really stems throughout the work. And then finally, I think what it thinks about in terms of Nuyorican aesthetic is the transformation of the poet from an individual self to seeing himself or their self as a collective. How do you bring in the collective into this poetic performative space? And so just keeping those three things in mind, because those for me are elements that will inevitably trickle down into slam poetry and hip hop theater. Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about training and how he trains, how he thinks about orality. And one of the moments that really resonated for me was when he was telling poets that they had to project in such a way that you needed to stop someone, right? Someone in the street to captivate them. And so this notion of being able to use your vocal performance as a tool to capture the audience, for me, really meant that they were also thinking about Nuyorican the term as an embodied strategy that was meant to do more than just create art, but to speak out, to confront, to push against.
What's been missing from the histories of this cafe? I know the story of the cafe itself is, I think, to some degree underappreciated. But then in your book, you're going beyond what's already been written about it to say, okay, now we need to look deeper and see who else is involved in this.
Yeah. So I do spend, I think it was important because thinking about poetry, theater, and performance, the Nuyorican movement gets missed out. So I do spend a bit, especially in the beginning, really grounding the historical contributions of Nuyorican artists, Nuyorican poets, and practitioners. But given our civil rights moment, right, the focus is on racial politics, and gender really falls short. Gender and gender discrimination. And so it's not unusual, like many of the organizations that started up in the 1970s, the lack of focus of women is absent. And so we see that also in the Nuyorican Poets Café. So what I wanted to do is really spend some time thinking about, okay, who is in that anthology and what are they doing differently that makes their work distinct from the male Nuyorican poets. And that really came about also through a poster that I ran in the archive in the New York Public Library. There's a picture of Miguel Piñero, of Miguel Algarín, of Lucky Cienfuegos, of a performance that they were going to be doing at the Delacorte Park Theater. And Sandra Maria Esteves was going to be part of that performance as well. She wasn't in that picture. And there was another group of Nuyorican artists who were also going to be performing, and she wasn't in that picture either. And so it was really obvious to me that she was visually absent, but on the program she was there. So it's clear that it was the same performance. And so that really got me to thinking about where else, what are the women doing? Since this has been such in many ways, a masculinist aesthetic that has been built up. And even the telling of the story is very much male oriented, as I point out in the book. And so what I try to do is really spotlight the work that the women did and how their strategy is a little bit different, right? And so what I talked a little bit about was saying how Miguel Argalin is really about projecting the voice, and the women are thinking about different strategies. It's not solely about projecting, but it's also about how do I connect in a more intimate way and personal way with my audience. And so that's the kind of direction that I take in analyzing the women in the book, in the first book of the Nuyorican poetry.
Yes, speaking of the women, you use this term, performeras, and you mentioned Sandra Maria Esteves. Who is she, and who are some of the other women who you identify by that term?
So because I was really interested in elevating the work of the Nuyorican women during that time, I was really trying to think about a term that encompasses their embodied strategies and also point out the feminist strategies that they were using as well. And so I play around with the word performeras as a way to really stress how they're using embodied strategies to challenge this systemic exclusion of women, and how they are trying to reinscribe a feminist perspective, in particular using the female body and infusing it back into Nuyorican history, into Nuyorican literature and Nuyorican art as well. And so I'm trying to play with that term and to really bring performance and gender together. And that's how I'm thinking about the word performeras. Sandra Maria Esteves is an amazing poet and performer and playwright herself. She wrote a play that I was honored to read. And she comes into the scene in the early 1970s and recalls, what's great about this project is that I've had several interviews with these women, and because the archive directs us to a very male narrative, I had to find ways of finding out different stories, right? And so this led me to do oral histories with these women. And I've had the opportunity to just not only have one interview, but have a series of interviews and create relationship with these women for a long period of time. And I'm thankful for that. And so learning from Sandra Maria Esteves, both her and another poet who was also in the anthology, Amina Munoz, they talk about the difficulty of presenting their poetry in the midst of all these other male poets like Pedro Pietri, Jesus Papoleto Mendez, Miguel Algarín, Tato Laviera, who used very loud, declamatory, militant styles. And again, like I prefaced in the beginning, important for the time as we're thinking a lot about political struggle, right? And it was when she first was invited to perform her poet, someone from the audience came up to her and said, she was a great poet and she wrote like a man. And that made her think that she wanted to intentionally push herself to find her own poetic voice. Amina Munoz, the same thing. She also wanted to find her own poetic performance style. And so what you see is these poets really thinking about how is it that you can use performance as a means of conversation, less about volume and vocal performance, but more about reciprocity with the audience. And so what I point to is this notion of what in Spanish we call láctica. So it's this kind of intimate conversational style of sharing stories. But the sharing of these stories is about cultivating revolutionary thoughts. It's about cultivating acts that are pushing against social norms without using the fashion of militancy or declamation. And so I was interested in really thinking about and positioning this strategy as a feminist strategy. And I kind of want to put an asterisk here because these women wouldn't necessarily call themselves feminists. At the time, to align yourself with a feminist movement, which they weren't part of because Latinx women were left out of that. And so they didn't see themselves in conversation with them. But as a contemporary person, I do see how their work is really pushing against that. So I am calling them feminists, but they themselves are shy. They shy away from that term. So I just want to kind of note that. And so their strategy, again, is not solely because they're women, but it's how they're using poetry and performance to construct history in such a way that it spotlights women and brings the collective into focus. And here I'm thinking about Charlotte Kennan, who really makes a call for us to read the work of women, not solely as autobiographical or biographical, but also to really think about how the performance in itself uses the physical, the gestural, the emotional to really construct meanings of the past, right? And so for me, I was looking at these poetries and imagining the performance as how are these women constructing a historical past that is different from what we see in the canon and what we see in the Nuyorican canon in particular.
We've been talking about poetry here, some of the differences in the style of poetry. But I think for some of us, this also might be a little bit different. Poetry, I think, at least in some cases, is associated with this more private literary experience. You're talking about poetry as part of a public performance. Could you explain maybe a little bit about how the performance side of it works? And again, some of these differences that you've mentioned between the different styles, how do those actually play out in actual performances at the Café?
That's a great question. So my experience of seeing performance at that Café, I want to also note is, of course, late 90s, like early 90s, late 90s now, right? And so part of my reading and analysis of the performances in the Café in the 1970s has lots to do with the posters that were created, photos that were out there, some audio recordings, but very little, if any, actual video recordings, right? So that's just to say that this is very connected to what Algarín brings about feeling. Like, what is the feeling that we're getting when we read this poetry, hear the poetry, and then also meeting the women, how they themselves manifest that as well. So Algarín was, like I said, really into pushing poets to not only create their poetry to be read, but create their poetry to be performed. That in the act of performing, you are liberating the self and facilitating the liberation of the collective as well. And so he was not interested in things being set on the page. And this is, I think, where theater and performance comes into play. He was really interested in what the body can do with the words that would then captivate and motivate and inspire the audience. And so this is where it becomes particularly interesting, because the style becomes about declamation, which is very much grounded in a Puerto Rican oral tradition of declamadores, right? So there is a long tradition of oral tradition of declamación in Puerto Rico and many Latin American countries, where a poet would speak his poetry or someone's poetry in the middle of the market, and would then become the singular performance, right, in this place. And so in Algarin's mind, the idea was that this person was to pull and attract people in the middle of this busy street of New York City, right? And that kind of energy of being a magnet, pulling people in, is kind of what he was trying to transmit to the poets. The women in per se were really, at least in thinking about Santa Maria Esteves, Luz Rodriguez, Amina Munoz, who were women that were part of this, and Martita Morales, who were women that were part of this anthology. What we see is that thematically, they're talking about the same, writing about the same themes, colonialism, struggles with unemployment, right? Fighting for working rights, right? So they were thematically, they were very similar, but they wanted to have a different approach. And for me, their approach really brought in familial ties, really brought in issues of how do you also talk about taboo, like taboo topics like menstruation or sex, which the male poets in this anthology don't necessarily deal with. And what they were doing with this while they were bringing these themes is, how do I create a conversation with my reader / audience in bringing up these themes? And it's that conversation, that exchange, that reciprocity that I'm really interested in, that occurs especially on the notions of embodiment.
Now, you move forward in later chapters. You kind of draw this line from these performances that you're talking about in the 1970s on through the emergence of hip-hop theater. Could you provide a little context on where hip-hop theater came from and how some of the feminist performers whose work you analyze related to hip-hop theater and contributed to it?
So I think we want to kind of go back to the Nuyorican Poets Café. And so the Café becomes their 70s and early 80s, becomes really a popular place for many of the artists, right? But there's a kind of moment where the Café lacks finances to maintain its building. And so this really means that they end up closing their doors in 1982. And so there was this moment where the city was promising that they were going to help build a cafe, but it never happened. And it also during that period, that Miguel Piñero, one of the founders, right, he also passes away from AIDS. This moment is kind of a very critical moment, at least also as Algarin tells it, because one of the things that Piñero requests is that he wants to be honored by spreading his ashes throughout the Lower East Side. And this request was actually then executed by Algarin. And so what we see is kind of a ceremonial procession, right, throughout of the Lower East Side in honor of Piñero. And this brings about the gathering of many artists who were involved. And this is the moment that Miguel Algarin also meets Bob Holman, who at the time was also coordinating these kind of poetry readings and poetry slams as well. And he asked Algarin and approached Algarin to see if he was interested in reopening the cafe. And so the cafe reopens a year later, 1989. And this marks really the second wave of the cafe, where we see this spoken word and slam poetry being ignited. And so now there's a shift. We've been talking about poetry, right? But now it's being distinguished, identified as spoken word. And I think this is really important because there's something about the informality and rawness that comes out of this performance tradition that is carried on from the Nuyorican aesthetic into the spoken word scene. And so right there, we have the confluence of space and traditions coming together. So inevitably, we have a mixture of Nuyorican aesthetic coming in, of some of the slam poetry coming in, some of the spoken word coming in. And of course, because we're talking about the 1980s, this is also the moment where we see hip hop emerge, right? And I can go into a whole discussion about hip hop and its roots, and its political and artistic and cultural vibrancy, right? But hip hop also becomes a major part of this poetry scene. And inevitably, we begin to hear people rap their poetry, bring in beats to sustain their poetry. All along, this poetry is also embodying characters. And some of the women that I talk about that were part of this kind of spoken word and slam poetry scenes actually developed their plays from poems that they created. And we begin to, for me, that kind of continuity really inspired me to think about, oh, wait, if hip hop was part of the conversation with spoken word, and spoken word exploded in the cafe, and how much of the aesthetic of Nuyorican aesthetic is really connected to all this. And so this is where the continuity for me really was clear. And also the players involved in them. A lot of the women like La Bruja, Aya de Leon, Mariposa, these were all people who rocked the stage with their poetry during these spoken word open mic events. And so there's an interesting continuity there. Also adding 1980s is not only the explosion of hip hop, but we also see the commodification of hip hop, right? And so we see hip hop then evolve into other artistic forms. So it's not only music, right? We also see it in fashion. It begins to seep in terms of photography, in many realms, not the least theater. Russell Simmons becomes this kind of monopolizes in some ways the kind of hip hop scene, and he actually begins to he created the Def Poetry Jam scene, right? And so that invites a realm of poets to really share their work, but with this kind of angle towards hip hop. And from there, we see the emergence also of Def Poetry Jam on Broadway, right? So that hip hop gets its little kind of spotlight on Broadway with Def Poetry Jam. And I also want to put an asterisk there. It's not the first time that we see hip hop on the Broadway stage, right? But it gets kind of all this spotlight then. But that's happening. And then also in New York City, we have the Hip Hop Theater Festival, who already was going into its second festival, right? So Hip Hop Theater Festival, Def Poetry Jam on Broadway. We're still getting Def Poetry Jam on HBO. Nuyorican Poets Café is doing their open mic scene. That's also being influenced by hip hop. So just thinking about all these kind of artistic movements kind of coming together and kind of interacting with each other, for me is exciting, because this is where I see the Nuyorican aesthetics kind of thread through these different artistic realms.
You mentioned some of these artists, Aya de Leon, La Bruja, Mariposa, I think you named some others. And I understand at least some of these artists, you were fortunate enough to actually see them perform. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience, and maybe also why are they so significant? You focus on some of them in chapters in your book. Why do we need to know them?
One of the things that really made me think about, what is hip hop theater, first of all, right? The question of what is hip hop theater. During that time, I was co-directing an intergenerational theater company called Ruby Theater Company, and I was working with youth who were passionate about breakdancing, rapping. And so inevitably that aesthetic became part of our practice. And we interweaved popping and locking, rapping, putting hip hop beats into our pieces that were originally created. And that gave us the opportunity to, somebody then invited us, Danny Hawk actually invited us to be part of this hip hop theater festival. Now, note, we didn't call ourselves hip hop theater, right? We were in some ways using an aesthetic that spoke really clearly to youth and that we were part of by virtue of being part of in the Lower East Side in New York City. I'm a fan of hip hop. I wouldn't say that I'm a hip hop head, but and so I was learning from the youth as much as they were learning from me. We were taking workshops with Pop Master Fable. We were learning how to rap. We were learning how to beatbox, and so this idea of a practice that you bring into notions of storytelling, I think, is what we were interested in. This really got me to think about, what were other practitioners doing that identified them as hip hop theater? And there was incredible work being done by women like Aya de Leon, like La Bruja, like Nalaja Sun and Mariposa. And because their work brought in for me practices of the Nuyorican aesthetic, that is, notions of plática, of creating these intimate conversations while using this hip hop aesthetic that is quite confrontational, right? And so really beginning to have a balance between that, which I thought was really beautiful and moved me. I had the opportunity to work with, not only work with, but see La Bruja's Boogie Rican Boulevard in the Nuyorican Poets Café. And it really got me to think not only about the intimacy of her work in terms of poetry, but the ways in which her poetry was really about characters that were then weaved together into a musical piece. So her piece went into an evolution where it was poetry, then it became like a small series of acts, and then it evolved into a musical at the end. And it was great to see that evolution using the same characters, using the same poetry, and really infusing it with a hip hop aesthetic, but also with a Nuyorican aesthetic, very clearly influenced by her cultural roots, Puerto Rican cultural roots. And so that kind of negotiation is what I'm seeing in the performance of these women, the work of these women, is how do you negotiate being Puerto Rican, having a hip hop aesthetic, bringing a Nuyorican aesthetic, being a woman of color, right? How do you navigate those various spheres and bring them together? And so that's what I wanted to really highlight, is the ways in which they are creating strategies to really exemplify how women of color are contributing to our society in many ways, and how they are pushing back and speaking out in ways that can remain invisible if not really taking the time to listen to them, to hear them, to feel them.
And this sort of leads into, I think, maybe sort of our final question here, which we've alluded to this problem. You've already got the problem of a movement like hip hop theater, or going farther back, the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. These are things that might not be familiar to people, even those who are pretty well versed in theater history. So you sort of got that problem to begin with. And then on top of that, you're addressing in your work the fact that the accounts that we do have of an institution like the Café, of later developments in hip hop theater, still exclude some really crucial figures. Do you feel like working on this project has given you any new insight into how we go about writing these histories, how we go about telling these stories?
Yes, indeed. It really has changed the way I engage with the archive, for sure. I think in the same ways that we ask our students, who is missing? Whose history are we telling, and from what perspective? It's more evident that we need to ask those questions, even as we think we're getting the entire archive, or that we have access to the entire archive. Those questions are crucial. But I think what's been more pressing for me is how I can use my skills as a scholar to infuse this notion of systemic equity in the ways we tell history. So that is, we have the skills, the lens to read And that's how we were trained, right? To really go deeper. So how can we use that historical lens to really infuse notions of justice? How can we continuously ask those questions? What story is not there yet, right? Even when we have the story that was missing, right, in the archive. And it's really also about thinking, how do we create histories that allow for other histories to be told as well, right? I think I was curious about learning, expanding on the history that was already told in terms of the Nuyorican Poets Café. And so that's really got me to think about, like, how do we create narratives that allows for opportunities for people to continue telling that history in different perspectives and different ways? And how do we make the notion of systemic equity in our historical narrative pervasive, right? So it's something that I'm constantly working on in terms of thinking about the institution I'm in, but then how do I make that a practice in my own work, in my own writing, in my own research? And I think that's been revealing to me in the process of writing this book.
So your book covers developments up until the early 2000s. Just out of curiosity, is there anything kind of after that, any sort of new studies that we should also be aware of?
Yes, absolutely. My book really focuses on thinking about the women who came out of the Nuyorican Poets Café in the 1970s and really continues to the early 2000s to think about the continuity between the Nuyorican aesthetics and hip hop theater. Karen Hyman's new book, which is just published, called Queer Nuyorican Performance, in New York University Press, really offers and builds on this narrative by really exploring the LGBTQIA community and the queer performances that really came out and were created at the Nuyorican Poets Café. And so I think that's a great continuation of the narrative, of thinking about how we tell this story of the performances, the different types of performances and strategies that were created in this space, that really is really in its essence. The cafe was really about thinking, how do we just create alternative spaces where we feel like we belong, right? How do we do that through performance? How do we do that through vocal performance, through an embodied sensibility? So I would really turn to Karen Hyman's work for a continuation of this history.
We'll post links in our show notes that will let you learn more about Patricia's book, as well as some of the artists whose work she studies. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.